This rotation here is just a little bit different than what we've had. We've had some phenomenal presentations. Mine's not really a presentation. I'm going to show you a practical application. I've taken some relatively punky wood. I've got a piece of spalted maple here that Brad gave me a year or so ago, and we're going to take a piece of this wood and literally give it the quality of African blackwood when it comes to turning. You'd be able to cut threads in it, anything like that. I want to tell you a little bit about the material first, and we're going to go through the steps involved. We won't go through the final step because we don't have an oven here and it takes too much time. I'm going to try to get you out of here in about 45-50 minutes at the max, and let you enjoy the stuff over there before, I think, John, you're next, aren't you? We don't want to jump into John's time. Okay, I'm going to talk about stabilizing wood with a material called methacrylate resin. How many of you saw my presentation at AAW back in, okay, well, you might as well just go to the other room now, or tell me what I said differently from the last time. We're using a material called methacrylate resin. The difference between this presentation and the AAW presentation is I can use brand names here. This particular product is Cactus Juice and Curtis Seebeck is the gentleman that packages this stuff up and sells it out of Texas. And the vacuum chambers, I manufacture the vacuum chambers. I sell the vacuum chambers. I have 3 different size units, a 4-inch, 6-inch, and 8-inch. All my vacuum chambers are this tall. I have a uniquely designed material holder that I use. One thing about the Cactus Juice or the methacrylate resins, and you can buy this material, basically the same type material at Woodcraft. There's a couple other outfits out there that's selling the material. They all would like to make you think that it's unique to them. They all like to make you think that they invented it a year and a half ago. This stuff was used in the 1940s. If anyone has read Sarah Robinson's book on spalted wood, and I'm telling you what, that is for $60, that is a phenomenal book. She talks about Mark Lindquist and David Ellsworth using the stabilizing resins back in the 1970s. So what I'm going to tell you today is certainly not new. It's really been very popular the last few years because of some of the things you can do. The knife making folks love this stuff because you can make a handle. You can make a handle for a gun, a pistol, something like that, that can. It's totally water resistant. It's almost like plastic in many respects. Tell you a little bit about the resin. Like I say, it's a methacrylate resin. There's no secret to it. It's an acrylic. It's in the acrylic plastics family. It has to be activated. And the shelf life of the resin, when it's not activated, is almost indefinite. Once you activate it, and this is true of all the resins that's on the market, you typically have a 6-month shelf life at room temperature. And when I say room temperature, is John Lee in here? There you go. John will tell you that room temperature doesn't mean 110 degrees. He came back from the AAW symposium, wasn't it, John? And walked into his shop at 112 degrees, and his gallon of resin had kind of expanded and cured. In fact, I'll show you some pictures of it if you'd like to see it later. Room temperature, 70 degrees. I have resin. In fact, I cured some stuff the other day, or stabilized some stuff the other day. The resin was over 1.5 years old. The secret to that is keep it in a refrigerator. If you keep it between 40 and 50 degrees, you can extend the shelf life on it very, very long. And it'll go a long ways.
Extend the activated shelf life?
Sir?
Extend the activated
Yes, the activated shelf life. Until you add the activator, and then when you buy gallon quantities of it, the activator will be separate. And you have to mix the activator in. What you do here is, it's about that full. You simply pour it in here. Sometimes the activator actually goes into almost a solid state and will become powdery. You simply mix the resin with it, shake it up, do it 2 or 3 times to make sure that there's 1 ounce of activator in here and 128 ounces of resin. So you want to make sure that the activator is thoroughly mixed with the resin. Once that happens, then the time starts. But again, keep it in the refrigerator. Besides that, if you're buying, I am a dealer for Curtis, so if you're buying it from me, you don't want to keep it in the refrigerator for 1.5 years anyway. You want to be using it on a weekly basis. The resin can be dyed. A lot of people ask that. The best material to dye the resin with is the aluminite dyes. On my instructions, and by the way, my instructions are on my website. You can download them, tell you how to do this, whether you're using my system or anyone else's system or one that you make yourself. This is a dye. You cannot go to local woodcraft and buy an alcohol-based dye and mix in here because it's going to have an impact on the chemistry of the resin. I strongly encourage you to use this dye only. You don't want to use any of the powders because first thing, we're talking about sucking this dyed material into the cellular structure of the wood, and if you have a bunch of powder setting out there that has any size to it at all, it's not going to go into the wood. And by the way, I strongly encourage you to, if you're buying the resin from me, just go ahead and mix it up at 1 gallon at a time. But seriously, just take a small container of the resin and put your dye in it. And when you get the color of the dye that you want, double that color. In fact, if virtually every dye you use doesn't appear to be black, you probably have not dyed it enough. It's amazing. You got to remember that you're only coloring the open cell structure in the wood. You're not dyeing the wood itself. And as a result, you won't get that vivid color that you would think you'd be getting with the dyes. There are techniques out there to do that. I'll be happy to talk to you about them on the side. Was there a question back here?
Yeah, thanks. We're good.
Okay.
You've used an aniline dye, alcohol, but it's all dried out. You can't do this after.
You could dye the wood first. Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, that's a good technique of getting some of the multicolored dyes, dyed wood, is you use the aniline dye. Chestnut dye is phenomenal. Very, very vivid colors. I love it. And it's manufactured in England. It is an alcohol-based dye. You can color the wood with that dye. Now, one other thing I want to tell you is this wood has to be dry to go through this process. So if you do dye the wood, make sure you give it some time to dry out. But and then you can mix same color dye into your resin or a different color and really get some uniqueness. The wood must be dry. Ideally, it needs to be 0. When you take the wood you're going to use, and you do not want to use green wood because when you start drying green wood, you're going to end up cracking. If you take wood that's 10, 12, 14% moisture content, you want to take that wood, you want to put it into an oven, and you want to heat it until at least 210, 212 degrees above the boiling point of the wood. And 212 degrees is not going to affect the wood at all. And you leave it in that oven. Now, I've talked to some folks here, so why I did it for 4 hours and it didn't work. No. Typically, when I take a piece of wood that is at ambient moisture content, 10, 12 degrees, 12 to 13 degrees around home, I will put it into an oven at 225 degrees and I'll leave it for 24 hours. Now, there is something critically important at this point. When you pull that wood out of the oven, first thing, you don't want to stick it right into the cactus juice, because what's going to happen is it's going to cure instantly because the wood's hot. You want to seal the wood up immediately as you get out of the oven. As a matter of fact, I deal with it while it's still hot. I use the Seal-A-Meal vacuum system because this material is impervious to air. Believe it or not, you run down and you buy your normal Ziploc bags, they're going to reduce significantly the moisture being pulled back into the wood. If you just take this wood and let it cool, the moisture content will probably go higher than it was to start with. You want to seal the wood, let it cool down. If you're going to treat the wood immediately, stabilize it immediately, just stick it into a Ziploc bag, let it cool down, and then start your stabilization process, and you'll be just fine. I did this several months ago, and that's why I like it, because if I'd put this into a regular Ziploc bag, it would have had some moisture to it. This wood right here will probably measure somewhere between 1% and 2%. By the way, there is not a moisture meter out there, and you can talk to Waggoner and all the manufacturers, Dumont, all of them. They will tell you that there is no moisture meter out there that's going to measure wood below 60% moisture content. If you run down here to Lowe's and you buy one of the digital moisture meters, and by the way, they're pretty darn accurate. They really are. But they're not going to measure below 6%. The only way you can measure the moisture content below 6% is by weight. And you can weigh this wood, stick it in the oven, dry it a while, measure it again. When the measurements stabilizes, then you know you basically hit zero moisture content. Okay, we're going to take this wood that's been sealed up, and we're going to open it up.
Can you microwave it down to the proper level?
Yeah. Yeah, but the problem with microwaving is two things. Number one is most people will ask me how I know this. You can set a fire inside a microwave. By the way, as long as the wood's sitting in the microwave and you've overcooked it, it won't do anything until you open the door. Ask me how I know. You're better off just going to buy an inexpensive, go down to the Salvation Army place and buy a toaster oven for $10 and you're in business. By the way, the thermostats on toaster ovens that are less than $250 in price are trash. Buy yourself a thermometer that you can put in that oven and adjust that oven to control the temperature at 200 degrees or 225 degrees if you're drying the wood. But to move on here, you do want dry wood. If you don't, remember, if you're doing wet wood or if you're doing wood that's got a lot of moisture content in it, the whole technique of this process is we're going to take this piece of wood, we're going to put it into a vacuum chamber, and we're going to pull just as close to a near perfect vacuum as we can get with the compressor or with our pump. It's going to be submerged in cactus juice or the resin, and the whole technique is that we pull the air out of the wood through the resin and create a virtually 100% vacuum on the wood. Then, once we've pulled all the air out of the wood, then we will turn around and release the vacuum. And Mother Nature, being what she is going to try to neutralize that wood at the ambient pressure. But instead of sucking air into the wood, since it's submerged in the resin, we're going to suck resin into the wood. That's the whole technique of the stabilization. Now, if you have a piece of wood that has a lot of moisture in that cell structure, you're not going to pull it out to start with, and when you release the vacuum, there's no place for the resin to go because it still has the moisture in it. What we're trying to do is replace those air pockets, if you will, the cellular structure, with resin. So what we do is we put the wood in the vacuum chamber, we submerge the wood in the resin, and I wish I had a little bit more. If I was doing this at home, I'd probably add another inch here. You want to make sure that the resin totally submerges the wood and plus a little head space. The reason for that is when you release the vacuum, especially with real punky wood, it's going to suck that resin right down. You don't want part of your wood sitting there being exposed to the air. No harm done, you simply restart. Pull the vacuum again and start over again after you've added more resin. 3 things you cannot overdo in stabilizing wood. You cannot over vacuum it. I have turned my vacuum on and left it for 2 and 3 days on wood. You cannot over soak the wood. Once we release the vacuum on the wood and the wood is sitting there soaking in the resin, you can let it soak as long as you want to. And then the curing process, which I'll get to here in a moment once we get started here, you cannot over cure the wood from a time standpoint. Temperature is critical, but from a time standpoint, I've left wood in the oven for 5-6 days at a time, simply because I forgot about it. And it won't hurt it, okay? Might run the electric bill up. Your local utility might enjoy it. Now, when we turn this pump on, we're going to be degassing this resin. Basically, we're pulling the air out of the resin. The resin will foam quite heavily. What we don't want to do is allow the resin to be sucked into an electric vacuum pump. I sell a Ventura pump, and I'll talk to you about that on the side. You don't have to worry about it there. But that resin will screw this pump up in a heartbeat. So you have to control it in the beginning, and what you do is you open your relief valve here to allow the, and right now we're just pulling a couple inches. And you can see, now if I close this valve, that resin is going to start boiling real fast. I love it in Denver, mile high, because if I did this at home and I had that valve right there, I'd have a half gallon of resin in my pump already. But you can see, and what you have to do is you kind of have to throttle. This valve here is basically just opening to the ambient air. And what you have to do is you have to throttle this valve until the resin is totally degassed and has stabilized, and then you close it and you start pulling. Right now we're pulling almost a near perfect vacuum. And I say a near perfect vacuum is 24.75 inches of vacuum. Now, in Denver, you're probably, I don't have the calibrations right in front of me, but we're probably pulling about 97 to 98% vacuum right now, which means that basically the pressure on the lid of this pot is about 1,100 pounds. And by the way, all these chambers, all the chambers that both Curtis and I sell are 100% PVC because you can leave the resin in it and it has no impact. I started out making acrylic chambers, and the problem is the resin will attack acrylic, and it will also attack Lexan, polycarbonate. So can you use glass? Yeah, you can use glass chamber if you're dumb enough to have glass under a vacuum in the shop, or 1,100 pounds of pressure on the outside of it. I personally don't want it in my shop. You can use metal pots with clear acrylic lids. A lot of people do that. You can find them on the internet. Guys, I don't know. Of course, we are in Colorado, but believe it or not, I guess the marijuana people use vacuum to pull oil out of, I don't know what they do with it, but they have metal pots that they do this with. The problem with the metal vacuum pots is you can't see what's going on. You need to see. Right now, all that air that's coming out of there is coming out of the wood. We've already degassed the resin. So what we're doing now is pulling air out of that block of wood. When I get done here with this, under normal process, and I didn't weigh this block of wood. By the way, that's a habit to get into, is to weigh your wood beforehand and then weigh it afterwards. Don't use a magic marker to write the weight down on the wood. Ask me how I know. The resin will dissolve the magic marker. I took 12 or 15 pieces of wood. I weighed it very carefully down to 1/10 of an ounce, marked it on the wood, stuck it in the vacuum chambers, stabilized it. Had no idea what the wood started out weighing at because the resin dissolved all my magic marker. So everybody asked me, well, how do you mark it? Use a pencil. It works great. So we're going to pull this until this stops bubbling. Now, the interesting thing is it's being pretty active now. Down the road here, typically a block of wood like this, I would probably put under vacuum for at least 30 minutes, maybe even longer. Again, you can't overdo that. You can certainly underdo it, but you can't overdo it. Once this heavy bubbling stops, you will get little tiny bubbles coming off of it. The majority of the people will tell you at that time you've reached probably about 97, 98% of the vacuum or the air that you're going to pull out of that wood, and you can stop your vacuum process and let it start soaking at that time. Oftentimes when I'm doing this, I do it in, I've got a two area shop. I'll just put it in the back area and just let it go and leave it overnight. Once you're satisfied that the air has been pulled out of the wood, and we've got pretty good vacuum on this, so then what you do is basically you shut your pump off. And by the way, for those of you who are using electric pumps, do not shut that pump off when it's under full vacuum. Okay? That's the reason this particular unit, I have valves all over the place. I lock my valves off and then disconnect the hose from the pump and let the pump run free air. What will happen if you don't do that, you can actually suck oil that's in the pump into the veins of the pump, and basically what it can do is lock up the stages of the pump. It's very, very difficult, or very hard on the pump itself. So always relieve the vacuum on the pump before you shut it off. Once it's all, you pull all the air out of it, you're satisfied that it's gone as far as you want it to go, or it's gone as far as it's going to go, then you shut the vacuum off, you open up the valve, allow the vacuum to drop to zero, and then you let it soak. The rule is you let it soak twice as long as you vacuum. Now, does that mean that if I vacuum it overnight, do I need to soak it for 2 nights? Not necessarily, because I'm sure that I have reached that maximum point on my vacuum long before that night is over. But oftentimes I will let it set for a couple days. And once it has soaked completely, then you can basically take the material out. You have to go through a curing process with your stabilized wood. Now, I typically will wrap, if I'm dealing with a square block like this, I will typically wrap it just as tight as I can wrap it in aluminum foil. The whole purpose behind that, especially if you're using your kitchen oven, which is kind of dangerous unless you sent your spouse on a trip, is the resin becomes extremely thin once you start your curing process. The curing process consists of heating the material to 200 degrees. It is absolutely critical that you get it to 200 degrees. It's absolutely critical that you get it to 200 degrees on the most interior part of that wood, for as the chemist will tell you, the manufacturers tell you, it has to be at that 200 degrees, or what they refer to as 90 degrees Celsius, for a minimum of 8 minutes. If you take the wood and you put it into your oven, let me finish up on the aluminum first. The reason I wrap it in tight aluminum foil is because I don't want any of that resin running out of the wood. If you pick up the piece of holly that I have sitting in the room next door, two faces of that holly has been planed. 2 faces has not, and you can see the resin on the outside. You got to remember that resin, that holly was wrapped up real tight in aluminum foil. Well, that resin that's on the surface of that would have been in the bottom of your oven otherwise. Now, is it absolute, and by the way, don't stack 2 pieces of wood and wrap it in aluminum foil and bake it, because you're going to end up with 1 piece of wood. Will it break apart? Yes. This will not fill cracks. It's not going to fill crevices. So if you got a crack in your wood, do not expect the methacrylate resin to seal that up. It's only sealing up tiny, tiny air spaces, okay? You can see what happens on the outside of the wood with that piece of wood next door.
After it's cured, will it accept stain
Well,
or not?
to a degree. You've got to remember, if I take this piece of wood and I say, I'll give you an example. Right before I came here, I did a piece of wood, a piece of burl for one of the young ladies in our wood turning club, and I weighed it, marked it with a pencil, and it weighed 1 pound and 1 3/4 ounces. After we cured it, it weighed 2 pounds and 13 ounces. So that meant that virtually 1 pound and 13 ounces of that wood was plastic. Okay? Will it take a stain? It's kind of like staining black wood at that point in time. Okay? It will, but it's not going to give you really satisfactory results. If you want to stain it before you resin treat it, before you stabilize it. Stabilizing the wood will slightly make the wood a little bit more amber. That piece of holly in there, I was very fortunate, because that holly is just about as white as you want to get holly. Boxwood will turn a very slight amber. Something else, if you can reuse this resin. I reuse it all the time. And the piece that I did for the young lady that was 1.5 years old, that resin looked like muddy water, because I had treated darker woods that probably wasn't perfectly dry, and some of the oils or some of the saps in the wood had stained the resin. So if you've got a real piece of a real light colored wood, and such as holly or boxwood, any of the real light woods, and you don't want it to get that slight amber color, you need to use fresh resin. Because this resin here, even though it was just as clear as it could be, will be darker. By the way, if anybody's driving, they want to take this gallon of resin home with them, whatever's left, we can certainly work something out, because I'll take it home, but I don't want to.
Quick question. Wall thickness of your chamber?
Schedule 40. So this particular, what's that mean? On a 6-inch chamber, that's roughly 5/16 of an inch. The quarter-inch chambers, I'm sorry, the 4-inch chambers, schedule 40 is a 1/4 inch, give or take. My 8-inch chambers will run about 7/16 of an inch. That chamber right there will take literally thousands and thousands of pounds of pressure. The problem is the flat areas, okay? This base here is 3/4 inch. This top is 3/4 inch. The seal is made out of silicone. I have 12-inch chambers and some 18-inch chambers that I've been using, playing around prototyping vacuum kilns, and I can pull 28 inches of vacuum. And on the 18-inch chamber, I will move this with a 3/4 inch cap. I will suck the center in about 1/8 of an inch. If I went any further than that, I'd go to 1-inch material in a heartbeat. Acrylic, an 8-inch by 8-inch by 8-inch acrylic chamber made with 1/2-inch plexiglass. When I say acrylic, I'm talking about plexiglass. Will absolutely shatter on you. And it's only going to shatter, again, ask me how I know, it's only going to shatter when you're giving a demonstration in front of about 30 people. Fortunately, when it shatters, you got to remember it's under a vacuum, nothing leaked. So we just very carefully shut everything down, maintained the vacuum on it, set it in a bucket, released the vacuum, and believe it or not, it didn't leak that much at all. It just crazed the daylights out of the plastic. Plexiglass and polycarbonate are not the materials to make chambers out of, and glass. But anyway, by the way, a gallon pickle jar, there's a lot of guys out there that are using them. It works pretty well. But boy, if it should implode, you know, you've got something dangerous on your hands. The biggest problem is I've actually seen guys take a pickle jar with a screw-on lid and actually make a vacuum chamber out of it, and it worked pretty good. Anyway, back to the curing. If you have and a lot of people say, well, I don't want to waste that much material on a 4-inch square that I'm going to turn half of it, you know, half that stabilized material is going to be on the floor. That's absolutely true. You can pre-turn an object and stabilize it and obviously save a lot of material. If you do that, then don't wrap it with the aluminum. Go ahead and treat it by itself, put it in an oven. Just make sure that you have, take a piece of aluminum and make yourself a little catch pan underneath it, because it is going to drip out. Now, how much resin are you going to lose? An infinitely small amount compared to what's in the wood. Basically, it's surface material. You might decrease the amount of resin on the surface, maybe 1/16 of an inch. Honestly, I've not been able to tell the difference, and I've played with blocks both ways. Now, everybody wants to know, what's the largest piece of material that you can do? How many people know what blackjack oak is? You must be from Texas or Oklahoma. There is not a bigger piece of scrub material in the world than blackjack oak. It is designed to be bad. I have stabilized 8-inch piece of blackjack oak 13 inches high that a gentleman turned an urn out of. And why he would want to do a disservice by making an urn out of blackjack oak is beyond me. But it did a beautiful job. The wood was extremely stable. And the interesting thing is when he hollowed the inside, I was very pleased for him to tell me that there was just as much resin, a cured resin, inside at the very center of that 8-inch piece of wood as there was on the outside. I have taken 2-inch by 2-inch blocks and used dyed resin, 30 minutes in here, 1 hour curing time, cut it in half. The inside is absolutely the same color as the outside, so it will penetrate right through. I honestly believe about 6 inches is the maximum you can get penetration.
What are your lids and the bases made of?
I'm sorry?
What are the lids and bases made out of?
The base,
Lids and bases made out of?
this is type 1 PVC, polyvinyl chloride. This chamber is 100% PVC.
And my other question is the stabilized wood dishwasher proof?
Is the stabilized wood what?
Dishwasher proof?
I'd say yes. Now, it would still need a finish on it. The wood itself is still wood. I've known guys that in the knife making trade, and they will tell you that when their knives, first thing, I'm not going to pay $300 or $400 for a knife and then put it underwater, but they will tell you that the stabilized wood is the only material to use on the handles if you're not using plastics, because it will take just about every weather situation out there. To say it's dishwasher proof, I don't know. My wife will put good quality wooden handles, knives in the dishwasher, and I just cringe at the thought of it, but it will help it. It's not going to crack, I'll tell you that, but the face of the wood is going to be extremely dry. Yes, sir.
Actually, I've found moisture in the heat during the drying, so if you do an air dry, not so much. If you use a heat dry, it'll pop it and remain.
Some of the dishwasher soaps that are used with hot water makes ferric acid look mild. You can destroy plastics in a dishwasher with some of the dishwasher detergents. I would not recommend it. I'm going to go ahead and continue doing this. By the way, what I just did had no impact. Now it will still. What we did there was probably 75% of the air had been pulled out of the wood. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we've dropped down here significantly. So when I open this back up, it did draw some resin into the wood. We're still pulling air. We'll let it run for a few more minutes and shut it off here. Yes?
When I do it and I don't have enough of the stuff to pour in, I put marbles in, make it go higher.
You can do that. That's a terrific idea. Use marbles or anything to occupy the space, especially with colored resins. If you mix up a little batch of dyed resin and you don't feel like you have enough, add the marbles to it to raise that resin up above the material height.
I've heard mixed reviews about putting an inline fuel filter to avoid the uprooting problem. Is this your demo setup? Do you ever do that? Do you have an opinion?
If you control, first thing, Curtis will tell you, and to a degree he's correct, this material does not vaporize at relatively low temperatures. And when I say relatively low temperatures, I'm talking about probably anything below 140, 150 degrees. And besides that, vacuuming has a natural cooling effect anyway. And for those who don't believe that, just look at the two sides of the spacecraft sitting out there where the sun's heating one side of it and the other side's a couple hundred degrees below zero. Just totally lost my train. There are some people out there that are manufacturing a secondary chamber, and basically there's a couple ways of doing this. In the world where they're really doing this professionally, they will have a secondary chamber that goes through a cooling process in case of any vapor. The work I've been doing on a vacuum kiln, that is extremely important, because what we're doing is we're raising the boiling point of the water by we're raising the boiling point of the water above the ambient temperature inside the chamber. Yeah, we're lowering the boiling point of water. At a perfect vacuum, water will boil, or at a near perfect vacuum, water will boil at 70, 80 degrees. The problem is you put a chunk of wood in here and you pull a vacuum on it, the cooling effect is going to cause that wood to, the boiling point, or the wood to cool below that boiling point. That's what I was saying. You have to raise the boiling point at that level of vacuum. You have to raise the temperature of the wood at that level of vacuum above the boiling point at that level of vacuum. And you're really sucking out some nasty stuff out of the wood at that point in time. Well, it's critical to have a secondary chamber there that you can condense that vacuum, condense that vapor before it gets to the vacuum pump. And typically they will do that through refrigeration. They will take that secondary chamber and basically drop it down. In fact, they actually use dry ice in certain situations and liquid nitrogen in large commercial applications to drop that temperature of the moisture that is being pulled off of that vapor that's being pulled off the material in that vacuum system to allow it to condense so that it will collect as a liquid in that secondary chamber. Now they're selling secondary chambers. The easiest thing to do is take a chamber like this, put your vacuum tube down to the bottom and draw air from the top. That way if you do happen to suck some liquid cactus juice out, it will not necessarily pull into the pump. Is that extremely efficient? Yeah, but I'll tell you what, if there's any moisture content in the wood at all, you're still going to get a vapor into your pump, even with that type of a secondary chamber. And it will contaminate the oil. Most of the experts will tell you to change the oil in your vacuum pump every 2 or 3 times that you stabilize. Retail, the oil that you're using in the vacuum pump is probably some of the most refined oil that you can find, and it will run anywhere from $10 to $15 a gallon, or a quart, I'm sorry. I pay $28 a gallon for it, and that's a very reasonable price.
Does stabilized wood, dull turning tools faster than wood?
Excuse me just a second. We're going to stop this process so I can hear the question. I'm sorry.
Stabilized wood, dull turning tools faster than just turning wood?
It doesn't double my carbide tools at all. That's a good question. It will not dull tools any more than a good quality hardwood will. I do not turn acrylics, and I do a lot of acrylic turning. I do not turn acrylics with anything but carbide tools. And I've used gouges. I think the world of David Ellsworth's gouges, and I use them all the time. I keep them very sharp, and I find that I probably don't have to sharpen them any more using on stabilized wood than I would on any decent quality exotic wood. Carbide, it doesn't make any difference.
You can put a smaller container inside a larger vacuum.
Sure.
So if you put just the cactus juice in a small container.
Yeah. I've had people bring a pen blank to me and ask me, and I just made some little 2-inch PVC pipe about that long, put a little cap on the bottom of it, stick it in there, have about that much headroom above it, toss it in an 8-inch chamber, pull vacuum on it, yeah. Anything you can do to reduce the amount of catches. This stuff's expensive. You know, we're dealing with $89 a gallon material. And, you know, you don't want to use 2 gallon of it to do a 2-inch by 2-inch blank, by 2-inch.
You're curing the acrylic at 200 degrees in the oven. What's coming off it in the way of fumes? I mean, can you smell it? Does it linger?
That's why I say make sure your spouse is gone. Yes, and it's not, first thing, it's not a toxic odor, okay? I'm sure all of us have smelled burning plastic. I've seen plastic burn inside a dishwasher. You know, where it gets on the drying element. It's nowhere near that bad. It has a mild acidic smell to it. I guess under enough concentration, it would certainly make your eyes want to water. But it's certainly not toxic in the sense that, you know, it's dangerous to even smell it. I do not recommend you doing it in your kitchen. I know some people that do. I know some pin turners that the wife goes shopping on Saturday morning and intentionally so that he can cure his stuff in the chamber. The biggest problem with curing of the wood is the dripping of the resin. You want a catch pan in there and typically line it with aluminum foil so you can take it out and throw it away because it'll make quite a mess. You don't have to worry about fire. And again, like I said, you can't over vacuum time-wise, you can't over soak time-wise, and you can't overcook time-wise. But it is critical that you maintain that temperature at 200 degrees. 210 degrees, absolute max. Do not depend on thermostats to do that. You want to adjust that thermostat based on a good, accurate thermometer inside that oven. The oven I have that I keep in my shop is Oyster, what is it? Whatever brand name. Oster. I don't know, it's about probably 2.5, maybe 3 cubic foot. It's sold at Sam's for about $90. The thermostat on it is highly accurate between 0 and 500 degrees. I can set it at 200 degrees, and I can assure you that the internal thermometer is going to read about 240. So I just bring it up to 200 degrees and keep backing that thermostat off, the valve, or, you know, the knob off until I hear it actually clicking off. And I sit there and monitor it. Now, Curtis is now selling a thermostatic control that is nothing more than I think he's selling it for about $160, and it's a $12 PID that he is buying with a sensor on it. You stick the sensor in the oven with a little clip, and then you plug the oven into the control. You set your PID for 200 degrees, and I can assure you it is going to maintain within 1 degree. It's according to how fast the heating and cooling, or the heating element heats up, but it will maintain the temperature inside the oven at 1 degree. And if anyone wants to know how to build one of those, about $25, let me know, and I'll tell you exactly how to build them.
Since it doesn't work as a filling resin, do you have a favorite complementary filling resin that is compatible and happy?
Probably the closest one is one made by, I think it's called a stabilizer, that's made by Minwax. And I don't know what the formulation is on it. I know some people swear up and down by it. It is not a, it's not a cure, it will cure at room temperatures.
Is that the hardwood sealer you're talking
Yeah, I think it's called a hardener. Is
about? Hardwood sealer.
Hardener.
Wood hardener too, yeah.
Wood hardener.
Yeah, and it's manufactured by Minwax, if I'm not mistaken. I've had people tell me that they use that. I don't know. I've never used anything but the methacrylate resin, and I've used 3 different brands, And honestly, I can't tell you the difference between them. The reason I use cactus juice is Curtis Seebeck is a super good guy when it comes to customer support. I called Curtis up here a while back and I said, hey, I had a bottle of hardener leak, and the next day, overnighted, the next day I had 2 bottles of hardener sitting on my front porch. That's just Curtis. If John's resin had been cactus juice, I would have gotten it replaced for him free. It was one of those off-brand things that came from Woodcraft.
What's your cleanup process?
Water. Warm water. This is water soluble. Thank you. I appreciate you asking that question. It is water soluble. Once I pull this out of here, we dropped this down about 1/2 inch from the beginning. So once you pull this out, hotel appreciate me doing that. Once you pull that out, you can, a couple things. Number one, you can leave the resin in the chamber because it's not going to affect the PVC. In fact, I'll oftentimes at home I'll have resin sitting in the chamber for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, simply because I'm too lazy to pour it back into the bottle and put it in the refrigerator. Once you clean the chamber out, just simply rinse the chamber out with warm water. Maybe add a little dishwashing soap to it, like Dove or something like that. It's kind of, it's got an oily. And by the way, it will not affect your skin. As a matter of fact, I'm the only person out there that sells this type of a wood carrier where you don't have to stick your hands down the resin. Most of them have a plastic thing that inside that you kind of have to lock with a cam to hold the wood down. And it is critical that you hold the wood down. When I first started this, I was using some large sockets, metal sockets, and I'd put enough sockets in there to hold this wood down. And of course you're getting, you're dipping your hands in the resin. My EPA and OSHA compliance thing, I should have had goggles on. I probably should have had face mask on. I should have an apron on. And I probably should have had rubber gloves on. I do use gloves at home. In fact, I had a pair in the other room. I was going to bring them over here simply because you get, it's not really an oil. You just get a little film on your fingers. And if you stick your finger in your mouth, it tastes kind of bitter. It's not going to hurt you.
I guess you were saying it doesn't make sense to like drill out your pins and blanks and stuff before you do it.
Yeah, you can, but you don't want to wrap them in aluminum foil. If you do that, just let them sit. You can.
I was thinking it would get more saturated from the
Not really. Not really, because and I'm assuming you're talking about something like a 1-inch pin blank. Yeah. I can assure you that after that 1-inch pin blank is in here for 10, 15 minutes, you're going to have as much resin on the inside of that wood as you do on the outside. It's amazing. Curtis, and I knew what Curtis was doing long before I really jumped into this. And in fact, I'd used his system, and I could not believe that you could take a 4-inch block of wood, say 4 inch by 4 inch by 12 inch, that was a reasonably, let's talk about maple, okay, soft maple, and get as much resin on the interior of that wood, right in the very center of that wood, as you could on the outside edges. I just did not believe that. And I dyed some resin a bright green, put it in there, stabilized it for 30 minutes until the large bubbles stopped, pulled it out, let it set for an hour and a half, baked it, salt it right down the center, and I can assure you, you can't tell the difference between if you have one piece that the interior of it is laying up and the other one has the exterior laying up, you can't tell the difference in the color. It's absolutely amazing. Vacuum is extremely powerful. Much more so than a lot of people think. If any of you, if you have any doubt, get on the YouTube or get on internet and just do a Google for a train car collapsing, because they pull a vacuum on one of these large tank cars, I don't know what is it, 15, 20,000 gallon tank car, 1/2-inch steel plate. And that thing collapses like it's made out of cardboard. And it is the same vacuum on that as what we have right here. It's an extremely powerful force. So, yeah, you don't have to worry about drilling the core out. Now, you're going to lose a little resin on that, drilled wood. That was an accident. The original was an accident, and then they did some experimenting. They had pumped the liquid out of the car, and it was on a pumping system that basically they went overboard, and there was some experimenting done on tank cars to see exactly what they're. NASA, who's from Ohio? I don't know exactly where it is in Ohio. It's in the Cincinnati area. NASA has a vacuum facility up there that is about 90 by 90 by something like 140, 150 feet. I'm talking about not inches, but feet. The doors on that thing is about 8-inch thick. They can put stuff inside it and test it for deep space. And they can pull probably 99.99% vacuum. If that place ever imploded, the state of Ohio will be gone. Yes, sir.
Charles, when you're dealing with like some punky burl, you're trying to get prepped and stuff, go in there. I see videos of guys like, using pressure washers or, things like that to kind of get all the junk and stuff before they put them in there. What's your recommendation on cleaning up some wood before you clean up?
If you're going to clean the wood up, first thing to remember, the resin isn't going to fill any gaps. So if you got gaps or something like that, cracks, checks in the wood, you're going to live with cracks, checks in the wood with stabilized wood. Now, can you pull that out? If it's got dirt or anything like that, yeah, you want to obviously clean it. I have sandblasted or actually bead blasted wood before I stabilized it. Especially burl, it has a lot of holes in it and stuff like that, simply because I want to get as much natural wood as I can. And but if you're going to use your power washer on it, you're going to have to let it dry back out. And at that point, by the way, you can probably use a power washer on a chunk of wood and not measure the moisture, or not increase the moisture content on the wood more than 1 or 2%. A lot of people think, well, I'm going to raise that wood to 30%. No, you're not. Trust me. You can take, right after you get down that power washer, and toss it into an oven, 225 degrees, and not impact the wood at all. You'll dry it. There's over here, I believe.
Stabilize all your pieces that you work, or just
No.
certain species?
No, can't afford all that. I stabilize the spalted maple. Brad is probably one of the most gracious guys in the world. He has brought me boxes of spalted maples, been sitting around in some of his shops for 20 years. And it's absolutely beautiful. But it is absolutely terrible to turn because it is just so punky. And I've stabilized a great deal. This piece of maple right here, even with what little we did today and what soaking we'll do this afternoon, if you notice, look how much, we had that up above there, about like that. It's pulled that much in there. I'm going to make a guess, we've probably just about doubled the weight of this wood. Do I do it on all the stuff? No. But if I'm doing a piece of punky wood or a piece of soft wood that I'd like to get any detail in, this is why stabilizing wood for the ornamental turners is fantastic. By the way, the only reason I went into ornamental turning is because I despise sanding. And somebody told me, well, anything you do on a rose engine, you don't have to sand because it's perfect in the end. So all my pieces coming off my Rose engine's perfect, according to my wife, no matter how they look. But to answer your question, yeah, I've got it's handy. I just leave, like I say, I might just leave a chamber setting there with resin in it. It takes me about 5 minutes to toss a piece of wood in there, and a day or two later, I'm ready to use it. I have a lot of stabilized wood sitting around the house, primarily spalted. It's phenomenal for spalted wood. Of course, a lot of people don't want to do OT work in spalted wood, but there was just a demonstration here just a little bit ago. It looked pretty darn nice.
How much would that block of wood cost you to stabilize in resin? How much resin do you actually mix up in there dollar-wise?
Well, that's certainly a valid question. You're dealing with about 8 pounds of resin per gallon. That piece of wood that I stabilized the other day, I put almost 1 3/4 pounds of resin in there, so that's almost a quart of resin. So you're talking about $25, roughly $20 roughly. It's $90 a gallon is retail on it, 89. So a typical piece that size, you'd probably take $25 worth, $20 worth. Okay. Now, if you had it commercially done, and how they do it is they do it by the pound, it would probably cost you $40 or $50 to have that block of wood stabilized. And I don't know their exact cost. Yes, sir.
Is it food safe?
Yes.
What,
It's acrylic resin. And
what if any common wood finishes are compatible with?
well, you're not going to oil it. You can, and I have done that. I love antique Minwax antique oil, and of course it's a penetrating oil. It's basically a dryer and what kind of oil am I thinking about? Huh? Linseed oil. It's linseed oil on a dryer. I have had reasonable success. Honestly, you can polish this wood. I've done a lot of pin blanks, and with reasonably punky wood, and you get enough resin in it, you can polish it almost like acrylic. Yeah, Dan.
Stabilized wood used on the wheel buffing system that buffs out very, very nice.
Yeah. Dan's done a lot of stabilizing, and you don't put a finish on it necessarily, do you, Dan? And that's the nice thing about the OT work. It comes out looking nice. It has I wouldn't call it shiny, but it does have a sheen to it.
You mentioned vacuum drying. Can you comment on that, how much faster it is? Or
Is Josh in here? Josh Salazan? There you go. It works perfect. I have taken 31% moisture content wood, put it into my vacuum kiln, heated the wood to about 110 degrees, and that's the trick with vacuum drying wood, is being able to heat that wood above that boiling point in a vacuum. And I will pull 28. Typically, the boiling point at the vacuum that I will reach is anywhere between 95 to 98 degrees. The high 80s, low 90s. Right, Josh?
Yeah, I'd like to say 120 is what you're shooting.
Yeah. If you can heat the wood to 120, you're going to do fantastic. I've heated it with my... I typically set my PID at 120. Now, the interesting thing is I'm not absolutely convinced. I'd love to be able to put some sensors, drill some sensors into that wood and see what the internal temperature of that wood is, because I can almost assure you it's not 120, even though the outside is. The thing is, I don't worry too much about it, because if I've got the outside temperature at 110 and it's been for a length of time, I'm pretty well convinced that I'm above the boiling point of that wood at the vacuum I'm pulling. And I can pull an unbelievably good vacuum. I use a Venturi pump on my kiln simply because I don't want to be pulling a bunch of crap through this, even with a secondary cylinder. And I will use a Venturi that I can very easily pull 28 inches of vacuum at 0.8 CFM of air. And it's a very economical way of doing it. In 3 days, I'll bring that moisture content down to about 9, 10%. You agree with the time?
I've been hearing from everybody 3 days is the maximum you need to get it down to 6%.
Yeah. I've had wood that I've dropped down. Now, the interesting thing is, and I can show you some pretty good sized chunks of wood, and I had one chunk of wood, it was, the pith was still in it. It was a half of a, probably about 8-inch trunk. It was about 2 foot long, and I ran it for about 70 hours all total at 28 inches. I had my PID set at 110. I had a silicone band wrapped around the wood, so I was reasonably sure that I was heating that wood up. And that's the most difficult part, is getting that wood heated above that boiling point. After I totally contaminated the oil in my electric vacuum pump, I went to my Venturi, kept going, and after about 70 hours of vacuuming, I shut everything down. I had about a 1/4 inch check on the end of the wood near the pith. I cut a 1/2 inch off each end of the wood, and it was absolutely perfect. It works. But if we can come up with a good way of heating that wood, vacuum kiln's the only way to go. Now, if you're dealing with flat stock, it's easy to heat that wood. You know, just put a heat blanket between it. You're pulling a lot of moisture out of the wood. Out of that block of wood, I probably pulled close to 1 gallon of moisture out of it, a gallon of water. And it was sitting in the bottom of the kiln. It was a 12-inch kiln, and I had that much water, and it's 28 inches long. And I had about that much water in the bottom of that thing. Not only water, but some nasty sap. Something that'll screw up an electric pump real fast if you're not careful. Yes, sir.
Charles Midwex has a product they call wood hardener that does at least a similar thing and doesn't require curing. Do you know anything about that? If you can contract compare the rest of it?
I have used some of that in a remodeling situation on some molding. It air cures. I have no idea if you're saturating, if it's an acrylic type material or not. It's not oily. I will tell you, the interesting thing is, most people find this difficult to believe, but you can take a piece of a spalted wood or a punky wood like this, and a lot of people, and you can get on the internet, there's a stabilizing group on Facebook, and you can get on their site, and they do one of the gentlemen down in Texas does absolutely beautiful coloring on pen blanks. And what he will do is he will take the resin and literally soak the wood in it, maybe only half of the wood. And he swears up and down, you take a block of wood like this and put it into 2 inches of the resin, dyed, and 24 hours later, that dye is at the top of that wood. They take it out of there, not under vacuum, just soak it. Take it out, cure it in an oven, then put it into the vacuum chamber, pour vacuum on it with another stabilizing color, or another color mixed in the stabilizing resin, and that will become the predominant color. And they get various colors, red and purple and red and blue. It's amazing the colors of the wood that they can do. And they get really vivid. I don't know how in the world they get such vivid colors. I have never been able to take the dyes and get an extremely vivid color. Dan and I I think he thought I was lying to him, because I took a piece of basswood and used chestnut dye on it and literally let it soak and dyed it black. And then I turned around and made some black resin and did it. And it looked like a piece of ebony when I got done. Dan did it. In fact, you have a turning in here, right? He did it, but it's interesting because he's got little gray streaks in it. Remember, the resin is not, if you're using dyed resin, it is not going to dye the wood. It's not going to dye the cellulose fibers of the wood. It's only going to dye those open cell spaces. I don't know what they're called. The voids, exactly. It's going to fill the voids. Now, you take a piece of real punky wood, the voids might occupy 30% of the total area. Then you're going to have to remember you've got 30% coloration in your wood. I don't know what I'm doing on time, folks, but I'll be happy to sit here as long as you guys want to. Yes, sir.
Are the vendors who are selling wood across the wall here, do they use a similar product?
Pete does not do stabilized wood. Les up in Northwoods, what's the website? Northwood Exotic Woods? Huh?
Northwoods, Figure.
Yeah. Les is doing a lot. In fact, I know he's doing a lot because I've sold him 6 vacuum chambers. He's doing a lot. The young man that is doing the casting with the burl out of St. Louis. In fact, Les is selling, and they have some of that next door here. The young man that's doing the acrylic casting, he stabilizes the wood before he does the casting.
So what are they using for, so what they're selling is not stabilized wood?
The ones that has the acrylic casting around it is, yes, the one that has the colored plastic around the wood where the wood's only part, yes, that wood has been stabilized prior to the casting. The greatest majority of it. I think he does do some of the harder woods without stabilizing, but most of the woods that he does in the acrylic casting. Now, he will vacuum stabilize the wood and then pressure cast the casting. And the only thing you're doing there is minimizing the air bubbles in the casting resins, and also ensuring that you're getting total penetration of the wood. And they will typically pressurize at about 60 to 80 pounds. Don't do that with a Harbor Freight pressure pot. Curtis Seebeck says one will blow up at 45 pounds, and ask him how he knows. He has a hole in one of the benches in his shop.
Is that a different resin that he's casting?
Yeah.
It's a different one.
Yeah, that's an entirely different resin. It's a 2-part polyester resin that he uses. By the way, it turns pretty nice. It can be rather chippy, if you will, but it turns pretty nice.
You had said earlier that you leave it in there for up to a day or 2 days. Would it harm it if you put it in a different container as long as it's still submerged so that you
Absolutely not. In fact, that's what you have to do if you use an acrylic chamber. Curtis started out and sold acrylic chambers for years. The chambers I made. Yeah, once you finished up the initial soaking process or the vacuuming process, yeah, they would take it out of that chamber, put it into a bucket, submerge it, fill it full of the resin, and let it sit in there and soak. Yeah. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, as long as it's submerged. And is it going to hurt once you release that vacuum and it does that initial sucking? You're probably 95% there. It's going to absorb a little bit more. But I could not believe the first time I used some dyed resin in a couple inches and it pulled that resin through a capillary action right up to the top of about 8-9 inches of wood. I just could not believe that capillary action was that powerful. Yes, sir.
Do you need to take the wood out of the resin and go straight to the oven?
No. Good question. Thank you. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, if I'm doing several pieces and I can't do them all at one time in the chamber, I might let it sit there for a week. Now, I would highly recommend that if you do that, you wrap it up with aluminum foil and stick it into a Ziploc bag or something like that, just to more or less hold the resin into the wood. But no, it does not have to be cured immediately.
Does using this in a oven preclude using it with food in the oven afterwards?
Yeah, it might taste kind of like it was cooked in plastic. But
Dedicated oven.
guys, I do not recommend, and you know, hey, I've been married 48 years. I know what it takes to remain married. We'd been married about 12, 13 years. First time I set a fire in the microwave. And believe it or not, the most terrible thing about, boy, this is a war story. For those who don't know the difference between a fairy tale and a war story, I'll tell you later. I was in base housing. And I mean, I filled that kitchen full of smoke. And it had smoke detectors. And I just knew that they were going to roll the fire department. And I was thinking, well, it's nice living in base housing in Scott Air Force Base, Illinois, but I might just be kicked out tomorrow. Fortunately, nothing happened. But I made a pretty smoky mess. It was a piece of cherry. And it only had probably about 25% moisture content when I started, and it had 0 when I finished. But actually, it was a very pretty piece of red cherry to start with, and it was a very pretty piece of charred cherry when I finished. I'll tell you the secret to microwave drying, and this really works. 15 seconds for the material. Let it cool till you can hold on to it and it doesn't feel hot. Another 15, 20 seconds. It will get hot. It will steam. Let it cool. Another 15, 20 seconds. You do that 5 or 6 times and you've dropped the moisture content on that wood down to 8, 10%. But you better let it cool. Yes, sir.
How stable is the wood once it's stable?
Extremely. And I have measured the moisture content on it, and honestly, I've not seen the moisture content go above. Around home there were, if I measure and I almost use my maple bench top that doesn't have a finish on as my standard for moisture. And I can put and I've got moisture meters, everything from $29 to $499, and they all measure about 13% on my workbench. I can measure a piece of stabilized wood and it'll measure 6, 7%. So, and a lot of it has to do with how much resin's in the wood, obviously. But again, guys, you know, you're taking a chunk of wood and you're making a piece of woodized plastic, if you will, if there's such a word, because you're putting a lot of plastic resin into that wood. And of course, it's not going to draw any moisture at all.
What's the effect of messing up and getting some moisture in the wood? You didn't get completely dry.
If you get the moisture in, before you mean if you use wood with moisture content to start with?
Tried to dry it in the
Yeah,
oven and
okay.
mess up.
If you put, and by the way, I've stabilized moisture, wood that was 12% moisture content. It will work. You just won't get that degree of stabilization. Actually, someone here told me that they had done that, in fact, one of my chambers, and a couple months after they had stabilized the wood, they noticed it had cracked. Okay, well, that was yesterday, you know, I can't remember. That was probably due to moisture in the wood that caused the wood to crack after the fact. But if you have extremely dry wood, wood less than 6% moisture content, that you can't measure with a moisture meter, and you stabilize it, and you do a good job of stabilizing, that wood is not going to move. That's the beauty of the stabilized wood cutting threads and making lids. You don't have to worry about 6 months later that wood moving on you and those threads being tight. We're ready to go to the other room?